The Thing in the Alabama Sky by David Eden. Chapter 1. The Devil's Hour. The clock on the instrument panel of Eastern Airlines Flight 576 read 2:43 a.m. when Clarence Chiles first saw the thing that would change everything. Later, much later, when the government men in their crisp suits and dead eyes came asking questions, he would remember that exact moment with the kind of crystalline clarity that trauma burns into a man's brain like a brand. 2:43 in the morning. The Devil's Hour, his grandmother used to call it, when the veil between worlds grew thin and things that had no business being seen crawled out of the shadows to dance. The DC-3 hummed through the Alabama night like a great mechanical bird, its twin engines singing their familiar lullaby at 5,000 feet. 20 souls slept in the cabin behind him, trusting their lives to his hands and those of his co-pilot, John Whitted. It was a routine hop from Houston to Atlanta, the kind of milk run that veteran pilots like Chiles could fly with their eyes closed. But something was wrong with the night. Chiles felt it first as a prickling at the base of his skull, that ancient warning system that had kept his ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats prowled the darkness. The hair on his arms stood up beneath his uniform sleeves. Even the air seemed to thicken, pressing against the windscreen like something alive. "You feel that?" Whitted asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chiles nodded, his eyes scanning the star-drunk sky ahead. The moon hung fat and yellow above them, casting silver shadows across the wing. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it should. That was when he saw the light. At first, it was just a red dot on the horizon, no bigger than a cigarette ember. But it was moving wrong, not with the lazy drift of a distant aircraft, but with purpose, with hunger. The light pulsed once, twice, and then began to grow larger. "What the hell is that?" Whitted breathed. Chiles squinted through the windscreen, his pilot's mind automatically cataloging possibilities. Military aircraft, maybe. Some new experimental job out of Wright-Patterson. Had to be. The Army Air Force was always testing new toys, especially since the war ended and all those German rocket scientists had come over to play for Uncle Sam. "Look, here comes a new Army jet," he said. The words coming out of his mouth before his brain had fully processed what his eyes were seeing. But even as he spoke, something deep in his gut, that same primordial warning system, was screaming that this was no aircraft. No aircraft moved like that. No aircraft glowed with that hellish red light that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent heartbeat. The thing rushed toward them with impossible speed, covering miles in seconds. Chiles felt his hands tighten on the controls, every instinct telling him to bank hard left, to dive, to do something, anything, to get away from whatever was hurtling toward them through the darkness. But there was no time. The object was upon them now, close enough that Chiles could see it clearly in the moonlight. His mind tried to reject what his eyes were telling him, but the image burned itself into his consciousness like a photograph seared by lightning. It was enormous, nearly 100 feet long, cigar-shaped, with no wings that he could see. 2 rows of windows ran along its length, blazing with an intense white light that made his eyes water. The thing was beautiful and terrible, graceful as a shark and twice as deadly, and it was looking at them. God help him, Chiles knew it was looking at them. The craft streaked past the DC-3, missing them by mere feet. Chiles felt the airplane shudder in its wake, and for a moment he thought they might be torn apart by whatever forces propelled that impossible machine. Then the thing was executing a maneuver that violated every law of physics he knew, shooting upward into the clouds with a burst of flame from its rear that lit up the sky like the mouth of hell itself. In 10 seconds, maybe 15, it was gone. The cockpit fell silent except for the steady drone of the engines and the hammering of Chiles' heart. He looked at Whitted, saw his own shock and terror reflected in his co-pilot's pale face. "Jesus Christ," Whitted whispered. "What was that thing?" Chiles didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because deep down, in that part of his mind that still believed in monsters and things that went bump in the night, he already knew. They had just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that was going to change everything. Chapter 2. The Witness. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. Clarence Chiles stared through the windscreen at the empty sky where the thing had been, his hands still gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity. The familiar drone of the DC-3's engines seemed muffled now, as if the air itself had changed, become thicker, more reluctant to carry sound. "Did you see the windows?" Whitted's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Christ almighty, Clarence, did you see those windows?" Chiles nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. He had seen them. All right, 2 perfect rows of blazing rectangular lights, each one distinct and purposeful. Not the random scatter of stars or the diffuse glow of swamp gas that the debunkers would later claim. These were windows, as sure as the ones in his own house back in Atlanta. Windows that suggested something, or someone, looking out. Looking down at them. The thought made his skin crawl. In 30 years of flying, through combat missions over the Pacific and countless civilian runs, he had never felt so utterly helpless, so completely at the mercy of forces beyond his understanding. The thing had passed so close he could have reached out and touched it, if touching such an abomination were possible. If his hand wouldn't have been incinerated by whatever hellish energies propelled it through the sky. "The flames," he whispered, finally finding his voice. "Did you see the flames shooting out the back?" "Like a rocket," Whitted replied, his face pale in the green glow of the instrument panel. "But no rocket moves like that. Nothing moves like that." They both knew it was true. The craft had accelerated upward at an impossible angle, defying every law of aerodynamics they had learned in their decades of flight training. No earthly aircraft could execute such a maneuver without tearing itself apart. The G-forces alone would have liquefied any human pilot. But then, whoever was piloting that thing might not have been human at all. The thought arrived unbidden in Chile's mind, and he shoved it away with the desperate fury of a man trying to convince himself he hadn't seen what he knew he had seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Some new military prototype, maybe. Some classified project that ordinary airline pilots weren't supposed to know about. Even as he thought it, he knew it was bullshit. The military might have experimental aircraft, but they didn't have anything that could make a 90-degree turn at 500 miles per hour without slowing down. They didn't have anything that glowed with that otherworldly light or moved with that predatory grace. Behind them, in the passenger cabin, someone stirred. Chiles turned to see a figure silhouetted in the doorway, Clarence McKelvey, the one passenger who had been awake during their night flight. The man's face was drawn, his eyes wide with the particular brand of terror that comes from seeing something that shouldn't exist. "Captain," McKelvey said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what was that light? That streak of fire?" Chiles exchanged a glance with Whitted. How much should they tell him? How much could they tell him without sounding like a couple of shell-shocked lunatics? The airline had strict policies about alarming passengers, and reporting UFO sightings was not exactly covered in the pilot's manual. Just some unusual atmospheric phenomenon, Chiles heard himself say, the lie tasting like ashes in his mouth. Nothing to worry about. But McKelvey wasn't buying it. The passenger stepped closer, his knuckles white as he gripped the doorframe. "That wasn't any atmospheric phenomenon, Captain. That thing was moving under its own power. I saw it change direction, saw it climb straight up into the clouds like it was riding an invisible elevator." The 3 men stared at each other in the dim cockpit, bound together by what they had witnessed. Outside, the Alabama countryside rolled by beneath them, dark and peaceful, giving no hint of the impossible thing that had just violated its airspace. "We have to report this," Whitted said finally. "When we land in Atlanta, we have to tell someone what we saw." Chiles nodded, though every instinct screamed against it. He knew what happened to pilots who reported seeing flying saucers. They got grounded, underwent psychiatric evaluation, became the butt of jokes in airport bars across the country. Careers ended over less. But what choice did they have? 3 men had seen something that defied explanation, something that moved through the sky with intelligence and purpose. If it was some kind of experimental aircraft, the military needed to know their test flights were crossing commercial air routes. If it was something else, then the world needed to know. "The Air Force," Chiles said. "We'll report it to the Air Force. Let them sort it out." McKelvey laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think they'll believe us?" 3 men claiming they saw a flying rocket ship with windows? They'll think we're crazy. Maybe, Chiles replied, adjusting their heading for Atlanta. But crazy or not, we saw what we saw, and something tells me we're not going to be the last ones to see it. As if summoned by his words, a faint red glow appeared on the horizon behind them. All 3 men turned to look, their hearts hammering in unison. But it was only the first blush of dawn, creeping across the eastern sky like spilled blood. The thing in the darkness was gone, leaving only questions and the terrible certainty that their lives had just changed forever. In a few hours, they would be sitting in a government office, trying to explain the impossible to men who dealt in facts and evidence and reasonable explanations. But for now, they flew on through the Alabama night, 3 witnesses to something that shouldn't exist, carrying their secret toward the sunrise and whatever consequences awaited them there. The engines droned on, steady and familiar, but Chiles knew that nothing would ever be familiar again. He had seen behind the curtain, glimpsed something that existed in the spaces between what was known and what was possible, and it had seen him back. Chapter 3. The Debrief. The Atlanta morning sun was already climbing toward its daily crucifixion when Eastern Airlines Flight 576 touched down at Candler Field, but Clarence Chiles felt like he was landing on an alien world. Everything looked the same: the familiar terminal building, the fuel trucks trundling across the tarmac, the mechanics in their oil-stained coveralls. But it all seemed somehow false now, like a movie set designed to fool him into thinking the world was still the same place he'd left when he'd taken off from Houston. It wasn't. It would never be again. The passengers filed off the aircraft with the usual mixture of relief and mild annoyance that came with any early morning flight. They had no idea that they had just been part of something that would echo through the corridors of power in Washington, something that would spawn classified reports and hushed conferences, and eventually the kind of official denials that only made the truth more terrible. All except Clarence McKelvey, who paused at the cockpit door before deplaning. His face was gray with exhaustion and something deeper, the hollow-eyed look of a man who had seen too much. "Captain," he said quietly, "what do we do now?" Chiles met his gaze and saw his own fear reflected there. "We tell the truth," he said, "whatever that costs us." McKelvey nodded slowly. "I'll back you up. Whatever you need, I'll back you up." He hesitated, then added, "My brother-in-law works for the Constitution. If the military tries to bury this—" "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Chiles replied, though something in his gut told him it would. Something in the way the dawn light seemed too bright, too sharp, as if the world itself was trying to wash away the memory of what had happened in the darkness. After McKelvey left, Chiles and Whitted sat in the empty cockpit, neither man eager to begin the process that would turn their lives upside down. The radio crackled with routine air traffic control chatter, pilots reporting positions and requesting clearances, the mundane business of aviation continuing as if nothing had changed. "You know what's going to happen, don't you?" Whitted said finally. "They'll want to know why we didn't radio it in while it was happening, why we didn't request clearance to change altitude, why we didn't follow protocol." Chiles had been thinking the same thing. In the heat of the moment, with that impossible craft bearing down on them, protocol had been the last thing on his mind. Survival had trumped procedure, instinct had overridden training. But try explaining that to a room full of investigators who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the malevolent intelligence radiating from those blazing windows. "Because there wasn't time," he said. "Because that thing was on us and gone before we could process what we were seeing." "You think they'll believe that?" Chiles shrugged. "Doesn't matter what they believe. It's what happened." An hour later, they were sitting in the Eastern Airlines operations office, facing a stern-faced man in a rumpled suit who had introduced himself as Captain Reynolds from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. He had the kind of bureaucratic face that gave away nothing, all sharp angles and careful neutrality. The kind of face that had been shaped by years of dealing with classified information and uncomfortable truths. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Reynolds said, consulting a yellow legal pad covered with notes. "You're claiming that at approximately 0245 hours, while flying at 5,000 feet over southwest Alabama, you encountered an unidentified aircraft of unknown origin that was roughly 100 feet in length, cigar-shaped, with no visible wings, and equipped with what appeared to be windows emitting intense white light. "That's correct," Chiles replied, hating how incredible it sounded when reduced to clinical language. "And this aircraft, which you were unable to identify, performed a 90-degree vertical climb at high speed before disappearing into cloud cover." "It didn't disappear into the clouds," Whitted interjected. "It just vanished, like it was never there." Reynolds looked up from his notes, his expression skeptical. "Vanished. Into thin air." "I know how it sounds," Chiles said, "but that's what happened. And you're both willing to swear to this under oath?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Chiles felt the weight of it, the implications. Once they signed official statements, there would be no taking it back. Their names would be forever linked to this impossible story, their reputations hanging on the credibility of their account. "Yes," he said, "we're willing to swear to it." Reynolds made another note, then looked up with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Gentlemen, I want you to understand something. What you're describing doesn't match any known aircraft in the United States inventory. It doesn't match any known Soviet aircraft either. If such a craft existed, it would represent a quantum leap in aerospace technology that would essentially render our entire defense system obsolete." "Maybe it does," Whitted said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Reynolds set down his pen and leaned forward, his bureaucratic mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Mr. Whitted, I want you to think very carefully about what you're implying. Are you suggesting that some foreign power has developed aircraft technology that surpasses our own by several decades?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Whitted replied. "I'm just telling you what I saw." "What you think you saw," Reynolds corrected. "Under conditions of darkness, fatigue, and stress, the human mind is remarkably creative when it comes to interpreting unusual stimuli. A meteor, for instance, can appear to display all sorts of characteristics that—" "It wasn't a meteor," Chiles interrupted. "Meteors don't have windows. Meteors don't execute controlled maneuvers." Reynolds stared at him for a long moment, then returned to his notes. "We'll need detailed statements from both of you. Every detail you can remember. Time, heading, altitude, weather conditions, the sequence of events. The Air Technical Intelligence Center will want to analyze every aspect of your encounter." "And then what?" Chiles asked. "Then we'll investigate. We'll check radar records, interview any other potential witnesses, explore every possible explanation for what you experienced." "And if you can't explain it?" Reynolds smiled that empty smile again. "There's always an explanation, Captain Chiles. Sometimes it just takes a while to find it." As they prepared to give their formal statements, Chiles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. He had the distinct feeling that he and Whitted were about to disappear into a bureaucratic machine that would chew them up and spit them out, leaving only sanitized reports and official denials. But it was too late to turn back now. The wheels were already in motion, carrying them toward a confrontation with forces that made the thing in the Alabama sky seem almost benign by comparison. The truth, Chiles was beginning to understand, was far more dangerous than any alien spacecraft. Chapter 4. The Machine. The Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base had the sterile, fluorescent-lit atmosphere of a hospital morgue, which seemed fitting to Clarence Chiles as he sat in the windowless conference room, waiting for the parade of investigators to finish dissecting his story like pathologists examining a corpse. 3 days had passed since the encounter over Alabama, and already he felt like a specimen pinned to a board, every detail of his life and career being scrutinized under the harsh light of official suspicion. The latest interrogator was a thin, sharp-faced man who'd introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Kellerman from the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board. He had the kind of precise clinical manner that suggested he'd spent more time with equations than with people, and his questions came with the surgical precision of a man accustomed to cutting away inconvenient truths. "Captain Chiles," Kellerman said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I've reviewed your service record, exemplary career, both military and civilian. No history of psychiatric problems, no disciplinary actions, no indication of substance abuse or stress-related disorders. Should I thank you for that glowing review? Chiles replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Kellerman's smile was as cold as a scalpel. What it means, Captain, is that you're exactly the kind of witness we take seriously, which makes this situation all the more problematic. Problematic how? Because what you're describing is impossible. Not improbable, not unlikely, impossible. The physics simply don't work. An aircraft of the size you describe, performing the maneuvers you claim to have witnessed, would require an energy source that doesn't exist and structural materials that we haven't even theorized yet. Chiles leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They'd been through this same argument with a dozen different officials, each one more condescending than the last. The message was always the same. What you saw couldn't have existed. Therefore, you didn't see it. Maybe your physics are incomplete, he said. Kellerman's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon? Maybe there are things in this universe that your equations can't account for. Maybe the impossible is just another word for not understood yet. Captain, with respect, I have 3 degrees in theoretical physics from MIT. I've worked on classified projects that would make your hair curl. I know what's possible and what isn't. And 6 months ago, you probably thought atomic weapons were impossible too. The barb hit home. Kellerman's face tightened, and for a moment the clinical mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. The atomic bomb was based on established scientific principles. What you're describing violates the fundamental laws of... The fundamental laws according to who? Chiles interrupted. According to us? According to human understanding? What if there are other understandings out there? Other sciences? The room fell silent. Kellerman stared at him for a long moment, then made a note on his clipboard. Captain, are you suggesting that what you encountered was of extraterrestrial origin? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Chiles felt the weight of it, the implications. Once he said it out loud, once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. He would forever be the pilot who claimed to have seen a flying saucer, the man who believed in little green men from Mars. I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that I saw something that doesn't fit into our current understanding of what's possible, where it came from, who built it, what it wanted. I don't know. But I know what I saw. Kellerman made another note, then closed his folder with a snap that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Thank you, Captain. That will be all for now. As Chiles left the conference room, he passed another door marked Classified, Authorized Personnel Only. Through the frosted glass, he could see shadows moving, hear the muffled sound of urgent conversation. He wondered what they were really discussing in there, what classified reports were being written, what decisions were being made about his future. He found Whitted in the waiting area, looking as haggard as Chiles felt. His co-pilot had been through the same gauntlet, subjected to the same skeptical questions and clinical dismissals. How'd it go? Whitted asked. About as well as a public execution, Chiles replied. You? They keep asking me about the windows. How could I be sure they were windows? Could they have been reflections, optical illusions? I'm starting to wonder if they think we're lying or just completely insane. Maybe both. They sat in silence for a while, watching the parade of military personnel hurrying past with their clipboards and classified folders. The base hummed with activity, but there was something different about it now, a sense of urgency that Chiles hadn't noticed when they'd first arrived. People moved with purpose, conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and everywhere there were signs warning about classified information and unauthorized disclosure. You know what I think? Whitted said finally. I think they know more than they're telling us. I think they've seen this before. Chiles nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. The questions were too specific, too focused. The investigators weren't just trying to understand what had happened. They were trying to fit it into a pattern, to place it in a context that already existed. Project Sign, he said. What? I heard one of them mention it. Project Sign. Some kind of classified investigation into... He paused, realizing how crazy it sounded. Into UFO sightings. Whitted stared at him. Are you saying the Air Force has an official program to study flying saucers? I'm saying they're taking this a lot more seriously than they want us to think, and I'm saying that makes me nervous as hell. Before Whitted could respond, a uniformed officer approached them. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. Captain Chiles? Captain Whitted? I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I've been asked to escort you to the operations center. They followed Morrison through a maze of corridors, past offices filled with men in suits bent over photographs and charts. At one point, Chiles caught a glimpse of what looked like a map of the United States, dotted with red pins, dozens of them, scattered across the country like drops of blood. How many others had seen what they had seen? How many other pilots, other witnesses, had been brought to places like this to tell their impossible stories? The operations center was a large room filled with communications equipment and situation boards. At the center of it all was a massive map of North America, covered with colored pins and strings connecting various locations. A small group of officers stood around it, engaged in intense discussion. One of them, a colonel with silver hair and tired eyes, looked up as they entered. "Captains," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Colonel Matthews, Project Sign. I wanted to thank you personally for your cooperation in this matter." "Project Sign?" Chiles repeated. Matthews nodded. "The Air Force's official investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena. What you witnessed over Alabama is not an isolated incident. We've received similar reports from pilots, military and civilian, across the country. Your testimony is helping us piece together a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Whitted asked. Matthews exchanged glances with his colleagues. "The kind that suggests we're dealing with technology that's far in advance of anything we currently possess. The kind that raises questions about who or what might be operating these craft and what their intentions might be." Chiles felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Matthews looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying, Captain, that you may have witnessed something that changes everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe." Outside, thunder rumbled across the Ohio sky, and Chiles wondered if the storm was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Estimate. The document that would change everything sat on General Hoyt Vandenberg's desk like a coiled snake, its red, top-secret classification stamp bleeding across the manila cover like a warning written in blood. Behind the Pentagon's reinforced walls, in an office that had seen the birth of atomic secrets and the death of wartime illusions, the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force held in his hands a report that would either reshape humanity's understanding of the universe or destroy the careers of everyone involved in its creation. 3 floors below, in a windowless conference room that officially didn't exist, the men who had authored that report waited for Judgment Day. Colonel Matthews sat at the head of a polished table, flanked by the scientific and intelligence officers who had spent the past 6 months compiling what they had come to call the estimate of the situation. Their faces bore the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who had stared too long into an abyss that had begun staring back. Dr. James Forrestal, the project's chief analyst, nervously adjusted his tie for the dozenth time. He was a small, precise man who had spent his career dealing in probabilities and hard data, but the Chiles Whitted case had shattered his faith in the comfortable certainties of conventional science. The pilot's testimony, corroborated by radar contacts and multiple witness accounts, had forced him to confront a reality that his textbooks insisted was impossible. "How do you think he'll take it?" asked Captain Reynolds, the same officer who had first debriefed Chiles and Whitted in Atlanta. His skepticism had eroded over the months as more cases piled up, each one more inexplicable than the last. Matthews lit a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. He'd seen combat in 2 wars, faced down enemy fighters over the Pacific, but nothing had prepared him for this. Hard to say. The general's a practical man. He believes in what he can touch, what he can prove. But the evidence? "The evidence is overwhelming," Forrestal interrupted. 47 documented cases in the past year alone. Trained observers, pilots, air traffic controllers, military personnel, radar confirmations, physical traces. the statistical probability that all of these witnesses are mistaken or lying is essentially zero. And the technology? Reynolds asked. Forrestal opened his copy of the report, pages marked with calculations and diagrams that looked like something from a fever dream. Instantaneous acceleration to speeds exceeding Mach 2, 90-degree turns at full velocity without deceleration. Silent operation despite visible propulsion systems. Whatever's operating these craft has mastered physics that we're barely beginning to understand. Or, Matthews said quietly, physics that we'll never understand because they didn't originate here. The words hung in the air like a blasphemy. 6 months ago, none of them would have dared voice such a thought. But the weight of evidence had ground down their resistance, forced them to confront the one conclusion that explained everything while explaining nothing at all. The intercom crackled to life. "Colonel Matthews, the general will see you now." They rode the elevator in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The report in Matthews' briefcase contained 341 pages of testimony, analysis, and classified photographs. It represented the most thorough investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena in military history, and its conclusion would either herald a new age of human understanding or mark the end of their careers. General Vandenberg's office was a shrine to American military power, walls lined with photographs of bombers and fighters, citations and commendations from 2 decades of service. Behind his desk hung a map of the world, red pins marking the locations of U.S. air bases, a reminder of America's global reach and technological supremacy. The general himself was a tall, imposing man with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He'd overseen the transition from propeller aircraft to jets, from conventional bombs to atomic weapons. He understood the pace of technological advancement, the way military science could leap forward in sudden, revolutionary bounds. But what Matthews was about to tell him would challenge everything he thought he knew about the limits of the possible. "Gentlemen," Vandenberg said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before his desk, "I've read your preliminary reports. Fascinating stuff. But I understand your final conclusion is somewhat unconventional." Matthews opened his briefcase and withdrew the report, its weight seeming to increase with each passing second. "General, what I'm about to share with you represents 6 months of intensive investigation into phenomena that defy conventional explanation. We've examined every possible terrestrial origin, experimental aircraft, weather phenomena, psychological factors, deliberate hoaxes. In 47 cases of aerial encounters by trained observers, we found no evidence supporting any conventional explanation." "And your conclusion?" Matthews took a deep breath. "That the unidentified aerial objects reported by Captain Chiles, Captain Whitted, and dozens of other credible witnesses represent technology of non-terrestrial origin. In layman's terms, General, we believe they're interplanetary spacecraft." The silence that followed was deafening. Vandenberg's face remained impassive, but Matthews could see the calculation going on behind those cold eyes. The general was weighing not just the evidence, but the implications, political, military, and social, of accepting such a conclusion. "Dr. Forrestal," Vandenberg said finally, "walk me through the Chiles-Whitted case specifically. What makes it so compelling?" Forrestal straightened in his chair. Multiple trained observers, consistent testimony under separate interrogation, radar contact confirmed by Robbins Air Force Base, and physical characteristics that match 17 other documented encounters. The craft's performance parameters indicate technology at least 50 years in advance of anything in our inventory or theoretical development. 50 years? Conservative estimate, sir. The energy requirements for the observed maneuvers suggest propulsion systems based on principles we don't yet understand, possibly gravitational field manipulation or some form of space-time distortion. Vandenberg leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before his face. "And you're confident in the reliability of your witnesses?" Captain Chiles and Captain Whitted are exemplary officers with impeccable service records. Their testimony has remained consistent through multiple interviews. They have nothing to gain and everything to lose by reporting such an encounter. "What about alternative explanations? Experimental Soviet aircraft?" Matthews shook his head. "We've analyzed all known Soviet capabilities. They're at least 10 years behind us in jet technology. What these witnesses described is beyond anything the Soviets could produce, even in theory. Atmospheric phenomena, weather balloons, mass hallucination, all considered and rejected. The physical evidence doesn't support any of those explanations. Vandenberg was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Virginia sky. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what you're asking me to accept? That everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe is wrong? That we're not alone? And that whoever else is out there has technology that makes our most advanced weapons look like stone axes?" "Yes, sir," Matthews replied. "That's exactly what we're asking you to accept." The general stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the ordinary world went about its business, unaware that in this room, a handful of men were grappling with the most extraordinary secret in human history. When Vandenberg turned back to face them, his expression was carved from granite. "Gentlemen, your work is thorough, and your logic is sound, but I cannot accept your conclusion. The implications are too vast, the evidence too circumstantial. This report will not be forwarded to higher authorities." "But, sir," Forrestal began, "the matter is closed, Doctor. The official explanation for these incidents will be atmospheric phenomena, experimental aircraft, and observer error. That's the story we're going with, and that's the story that will stick." Matthews felt something die inside him. "And the report, General?" Vandenberg's smile was colder than a graveside in winter. "What report, Colonel? I have no record of any such document." As they left the Pentagon that evening, carrying their briefcases full of photocopies and personal notes, none of them spoke about what had just happened. They all understood that they had just witnessed the burial of the most important discovery in human history, smothered in its crib by the very institutions sworn to protect the truth. But secrets have a way of surviving, of finding cracks in even the most carefully constructed walls. And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic maze of the military-industrial complex, copies of the estimate of the situation would endure, waiting for the day when the truth could no longer be contained. The sky over Alabama still held its secrets, but now so did they. Chapter 6. The Cover-Up. The bonfire behind the Pentagon burned with the intensity of 1,000 secrets dying at once. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Washington morning, 3 months after General Vandenberg's rejection, classified documents fed the flames like sacrificial offerings to the gods of plausible deniability. Edward Ruppelt, the newly appointed director of what would soon become Project Blue Book, watched the smoke rise into the October sky and wondered how many truths were turning to ash before his eyes. "Beautiful morning for a barbecue," said Colonel Watson, the Pentagon's chief of information security, stirring the fire with a metal poker. His face was illuminated by the orange glow, giving him the appearance of a demon presiding over some infernal ritual. "Amazing how much paperwork accumulates when you're investigating swamp gas and weather balloons." Ruppelt said nothing. He'd read the estimate of the situation before it was officially destroyed, had seen the methodical analysis and damning conclusions that 47 separate encounters pointed to technology beyond human capability. Now he was watching it burn, along with hundreds of witness statements, technical analyses, and photographic evidence that would never see the light of day. "You know what the beauty of this is?" Watson continued, seemingly oblivious to Ruppelt's discomfort. "We're not really destroying the truth. We're just refining it, making it more palatable for public consumption. By lying about it?" Watson's laugh was as cold as winter wind through a cemetery. "By managing it, Ruppelt. By understanding that sometimes the truth is too dangerous for its own good. Do you know what would happen if we released that report? If we told the American people that we're being visited by beings with technology that makes our atomic bombs look like firecrackers?" Ruppelt knew. Panic, economic collapse, the complete breakdown of social order as humanity grappled with the knowledge that they were not the apex predators they believed themselves to be. But knowing the consequences didn't make the cover-up any easier to stomach. "The Chiles Whitted case," he said quietly. "What's the official explanation going to be?" Watson consulted a manila folder that had somehow escaped the flames. "Meteor. Specifically, a bolide, an extremely bright fireball. Dr. Menzel from Harvard is preparing a report that explains how atmospheric conditions could have created the illusion of windows and controlled flight patterns. And people will believe that? People will believe what they want to believe. Most folks aren't interested in having their worldview shattered by alien visitors. They want nice, rational explanations that let them sleep at night. But some people weren't content with nice, rational explanations. 300 miles away, in a small apartment near the University of Arizona, Dr. James McDonald was conducting his own investigation into the Chiles Whitted encounter. 20 years had passed since that night over Alabama, but McDonald's interest had been sparked by inconsistencies in the official reports, details that didn't quite match the meteor explanation, witnesses whose testimony had been subtly altered in the final documentation. McDonald was the kind of scientist who couldn't let sleeping dogs lie, a physicist whose curiosity had led him into the murky waters of UFO research, despite the career suicide it represented. He'd tracked down both pilots, now retired from commercial aviation, and interviewed them extensively about their experiences. What he'd found troubled him deeply. The windows, Clarence Chiles said, sitting in McDonald's hotel room with the wariness of a man who'd spent 20 years being told he hadn't seen what he knew he'd seen. They keep saying we couldn't have seen windows on a meteor, but I know what I saw. 2 rows of bright, rectangular lights, evenly spaced along the side of that thing. Not random flashes or reflections. Windows. McDonald made notes on his yellow legal pad, documenting every detail. The official Air Force report described the object as a meteor with an unusual appearance due to atmospheric conditions, but Chiles' testimony painted a picture of something far more extraordinary. The maneuvers, John Whitted added. He'd aged harder than his former co-pilot, the weight of official disbelief etched into the lines around his eyes. Meteors don't change direction. They don't execute 90-degree climbs. What we saw was under intelligent control. Tell me about the sound, McDonald requested, or lack thereof. Dead silent, Chiles replied. Even with those flames shooting out the back, we couldn't hear a thing. No engine noise, no wind noise, nothing. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned off. McDonald frowned. Every detail made the meteor explanation less credible and the suppressed conclusions more plausible. But he was fighting against 20 years of official debunking, 2 decades of carefully crafted cover stories that had been repeated so often they'd taken on the weight of accepted fact. Back in Washington, the machine of disinformation continued its work. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as the Air Force's scientific consultant on UFO cases, was preparing his own analysis of the Chiles Whitted encounter. Hynek was a practical man, a scientist who preferred terrestrial explanations to extraordinary ones, but even he was troubled by the case's details. The timing bothers me, he confided to his assistant as they reviewed the classified files. The object appeared on July 24th, during the peak of the Aquarid meteor shower. That supports the meteor theory. But meteors don't hover. They don't execute controlled maneuvers, and they certainly don't display what appears to be artificial lighting in regular patterns. Hynek removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. There are elements of this case that simply don't fit the official explanation. So what do? Hynek was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs and witness statements spread across his desk. We follow our orders. We support the meteor explanation, and we hope that history will forgive us for choosing institutional loyalty over scientific honesty. Meanwhile, in a basement archive at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a young airman named Robert Jameson was discovering that some secrets refused to stay buried. While cataloging old files for digitization, he'd stumbled across a manila envelope marked Chiles Whitted Classified that contained photocopies of documents that officially no longer existed. The witness statements were different from the ones in the public record, more detailed, more specific about the craft's appearance and behavior. There were radar tracking reports that had never been mentioned in the official analysis, ground observer accounts that corroborated the pilot's testimony, and most damning of all, a preliminary report recommending immediate investigation of possible extraterrestrial contact. Jameson sat in the fluorescent-lit basement, surrounded by the detritus of decades of military bureaucracy, and realized he was holding evidence of the greatest cover-up in human history. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Outside, the Ohio sky was clear and star-filled, the same sky that Chiles and Whitted had flown through 20 years ago when they'd encountered something that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. The truth was still out there, scattered across forgotten files and suppressed reports, waiting for someone brave enough to piece it together. But truth, as Jameson was beginning to understand, was a dangerous thing in a world that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable realities. The machine that had buried the estimate of the situation was still running, still grinding up inconvenient facts and spitting out palatable fiction. And somewhere in the vastness of space, the creators of that impossible craft were watching, waiting, perhaps wondering why the inhabitants of the third planet from an ordinary yellow star were so determined to deny what their own eyes had seen. The cover-up was complete, but the mystery remained. And in the end, that might be the most terrifying truth of all. Chapter 7. The Haunting. 50 years had passed since that night over Alabama, but Clarence Chiles still woke up in cold sweats, his dreams filled with blazing windows and impossible machines that moved through the darkness like predators stalking prey. The nursing home in Coral Gables was a pleasant enough place to die, with its palm trees and shuffleboard courts and the kind of determinedly cheerful staff that specialized in making the final years bearable. But no amount of Florida sunshine could chase away the shadows that had followed him since 1948. The young man sitting across from him in the day room had introduced himself as David Patterson, a freelance journalist working on what he called a comprehensive examination of early UFO encounters. He was earnest and persistent, the kind of reporter who believed that truth was still worth pursuing, even when it had been buried under decades of official denial and bureaucratic amnesia. "Mr. Chiles," Patterson said, consulting his digital recorder, "I've read every official report, every debunking article, every scientific analysis of your encounter. But I'd like to hear it from you, in your own words, one more time." Chiles studied the young man's face, looking for the telltale signs of mockery or condescension that had greeted his story for half a century. He found only genuine curiosity and something that might have been belief. It was enough. "You know what the hardest part has been?" he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Not the ridicule, not the official denials, not even the way my own company started giving me the cold shoulder after the story broke. The hardest part has been living with the knowledge that we're not alone, and that the people in charge would rather risk everything than admit it." Patterson leaned forward. "What do you mean, risk everything?" "Think about it, son. Whatever was piloting that craft had technology that could cross interstellar space, that could outmaneuver anything we had in the air. If they'd wanted to hurt us, to invade or conquer, there wasn't a damn thing we could have done to stop them. But they didn't. They just observed, like scientists studying insects. And that scared the government more than an invasion would have?" Chiles nodded slowly. "Fear you can weaponize. Fear you can use to justify bigger budgets, more weapons, tighter control. But being ignored, being treated like we're not even worth conquering, that's the kind of truth that brings down governments." Across the country, in a cluttered office at the University of Arizona, the papers of Dr. James McDonald sat in archival boxes, waiting for the next generation of researchers to discover the meticulous work he'd done before his mysterious death in 1971. Among those papers was a folder marked Chiles Whitted, Final Analysis, that contained interviews, documents, and conclusions that painted a picture very different from the official meteor explanation. Dr. Sarah Chen, a graduate student in aerospace engineering, had stumbled across McDonald's work while researching anomalous atmospheric phenomena for her dissertation. What she'd found had changed the trajectory of her academic career and quite possibly her life. "The trajectory analysis is all wrong," she explained to her advisor, Dr. Marcus Webb, spreading McDonald's calculations across his desk. "A meteor following the path described by the pilots would have impacted somewhere in northern Georgia, but there's no record of any impact, no crater, no recovered fragments. Nothing." Webb examined the papers with the skeptical eye of a man who'd spent 30 years avoiding career-ending controversies. Maybe the meteor disintegrated in the atmosphere. It happens. Not from 5,000 feet. And look at this. Chen pulled out a radar analysis that McDonald had obtained through sources he'd never identified. There were 3 separate radar contacts tracking an object that night. The object maintained consistent altitude and heading for over 40 miles before executing what the radar operators described as impossible maneuvers. Radar can malfunction. There can be atmospheric reflections, equipment failures. From 3 separate installations, all experiencing the same malfunction at the same time. Chen shook her head. Dr. Webb, I think Dr. McDonald was onto something. I think the Chiles Whitted encounter was exactly what the pilots said it was. Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents that seemed to mock 50 years of scientific orthodoxy. Sarah, even if you're right, even if McDonald was right, what are you planning to do about it? Publish a paper claiming that alien spacecraft are visiting Earth? You know what that would do to your career. Maybe some things are more important than careers. Meanwhile, in the basement of the National Archives, Robert Jameson, now a gray-haired archivist nearing retirement, was conducting his own quiet investigation into the files that officially didn't exist. Over the decades, he'd managed to locate fragments of the suppressed evidence, photocopies hidden in misfiled folders, carbon copies tucked into unrelated case files, witness statements that had somehow escaped the Great Purge of the early 1950s. What he'd discovered painted a picture of a cover-up so vast and systematic that it made Watergate look like a parking ticket. The Chiles Whitted case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of encounters that stretched back to the 1940s and forward to the present day. A pattern that someone very powerful was determined to keep hidden. The problem, Jameson confided to his colleague, Margaret Foster, as they worked late in the archives, is that we're only seeing fragments, pieces of a puzzle that someone took great care to scatter. But if you could put those pieces together, Foster asked, then we'd have proof that the most important story in human history has been systematically suppressed for over half a century. Back in Florida, Clarence Chiles was nearing the end of his interview with Patterson, his energy flagging as the afternoon wore on. But there was something else he needed to say, something that had been eating at him for decades. "You want to know the real tragedy?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that they covered it up. It's that they made us complicit in our own ignorance. They turned us into a society that would rather believe comfortable lies than face difficult truths." "But people are starting to ask questions again," Patterson said. "There are whistleblowers, leaked documents, congressional hearings." Chiles laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, they've been starting to ask questions for 50 years, and every time they get close to the truth, something happens. Witnesses die in car accidents, documents disappear, funding gets cut, the machine protects itself." "Then why are you talking to me?" The old pilot was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Florida sky where ordinary aircraft traced their predictable paths between airports. "Because I'm dying, and dead men have nothing left to lose. And because maybe, just maybe, the truth is stronger than the lies they've built around it." That night, Patterson sat in his hotel room, transcribing the interview and wondering what to do with the story that was taking shape. He'd started his investigation expecting to debunk the Chiles Whitted encounter, to add it to the pile of misidentified meteors and atmospheric anomalies that cluttered UFO literature. Instead, he'd found something much more disturbing, evidence of a truth so profound that it had been buried under 50 years of official denial. The question was whether anyone would believe him, whether anyone wanted to believe him. Outside his window, the lights of Miami glittered like earthbound stars, each one representing someone who might be looking up at the sky and wondering if we're alone. The answer to that question had been known since 1948, hidden in classified files and suppressed reports, waiting for someone brave enough to drag it into the light. But truth, Patterson was beginning to understand, was like a ghost. It haunted the living until someone was finally willing to acknowledge its presence. And the ghost of that night over Alabama was still waiting, still demanding recognition, still asking the question that had changed everything for two pilots who'd had the misfortune to see too much. The haunting would continue until the truth was told. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface, even if it took 50 years, even if it took forever. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. The email arrived at 3:17 a.m., the digital devil's hour, its timestamp burned into David Patterson's retinas as he sat hunched over his laptop in the cramped Washington hotel room that had become his makeshift headquarters. The sender was listed as Deep Archive, and the message was brief enough to chill his blood. They know you're close. They know about the documents. Meet me at the Lincoln Memorial, dawn. Come alone and bring everything. Patterson had spent 18 months following the trail of the Chiles Whitted encounter, 18 months of dead ends and buried evidence and witnesses who died just before he could interview them. Clarence Chiles had passed away 3 weeks after their conversation, taking his secrets to a Florida grave. John Whitted had been dead for a decade, his final years spent in bitter isolation, a man haunted by the knowledge that his truth had been transformed into a lie. But the truth, Patterson had learned, was like cancer. It spread through cracks in the official narrative, metastasized in forgotten files and whispered conversations, grew stronger even as those who tried to contain it thought they had succeeded in cutting it out. The story was bigger than one encounter over Alabama. Much bigger. The Lincoln Memorial at sunrise was a cathedral of shadows and golden light, the great emancipator brooding over a city built on secrets and compromises. Patterson found the man calling himself Deep Archive, sitting on the steps, a figure so nondescript that he seemed to fade into the marble behind him. Gray hair, gray suit, gray eyes that held the weight of decades spent in the machinery of government. "You're Patterson," the man said. It wasn't a question. "And you're Robert Jameson, former Air Force Intelligence, now National Archives. The man who's been leaking documents for the past 20 years. Jameson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Former everything, son. As of yesterday, I officially don't exist. 47 years of government service, and they wiped me out with a keystroke." Patterson sat down beside him, noting the manila envelope clutched in Jameson's hands like a lifeline. "Because of what you found. Because of what I'm about to give you." Jameson's voice carried the weight of a man who had finally decided that some truths were worth dying for. The complete file on Project Sign, including the original estimate of the situation. Copies that survived the purge because someone, I never found out who, had the foresight to bury them so deep in the bureaucracy that even the cover-up artists couldn't find them all. The envelope changed hands with the solemnity of a religious ritual. Patterson felt its weight, knowing that he was holding the most important story in human history. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I'm 73 years old, and I'm tired of carrying this secret. Because the people who ordered the cover-up are mostly dead, and their children deserve to know what their parents did, and because something's coming." "What do you mean?" Jameson pointed to the sky, where the first commercial aircraft of the day were beginning their approach to Reagan National. "The encounters never stopped, son. They just got better at hiding them. But lately, there's been an uptick. More sightings, more witnesses, more evidence that even the cover-up boys can't suppress completely. It's like they're preparing for something, like they're getting ready to stop hiding." Patterson opened the envelope with trembling hands, scanning the documents that proved what Clarence Chiles and John Whitted had insisted for over 50 years. That on the night of July 24, 1948, two experienced pilots had encountered technology of non-terrestrial origin, and that the United States government had known it, studied it, and then systematically hidden it from the world. "The conclusions," Patterson breathed, reading from the original report. "The most logical explanation for the unidentified aerial objects reported by qualified observers is that they represent interplanetary spacecraft of unknown origin, operated by intelligences far in advance of terrestrial science." Jesus Christ. General Vandenberg called it insufficient evidence and speculative conclusions, Jameson said, but he never destroyed his personal copy, found it in his papers after he died. The man who officially rejected the extraterrestrial hypothesis kept his own proof that it was true. As the sun climbed higher over the Potomac, Patterson realized that he was sitting at the epicenter of a moment that would change everything. The story he would write wouldn't just expose a cover-up, it would force humanity to confront the reality that we are not alone, that we never have been, and that the implications of that truth had been deemed too dangerous for public consumption. What happened to the others? He asked. The witnesses, the investigators, the people who knew. Jameson's face darkened. Some died natural deaths, some didn't. Dr. McDonald, the physicist who interviewed Chiles and Whitted in the 60s, they said he committed suicide, but his family never believed it. Too many questions he was asking, too close to conclusions they couldn't allow. And now I'm asking the same questions. Yes, which is why you need to move fast. Get the story out before they can stop you. Multiple outlets, multiple platforms, enough copies in enough hands that they can't suppress them all. Patterson nodded, his mind already racing with the logistics of revelation. But there was something else eating at him, a question that had haunted him since his first interview with Chiles. Why, he asked, why come here at all? If they have technology that advanced, if they can cross interstellar space, why bother with Earth? Why risk exposure by flying through our airspace? Jameson was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the distant Capitol dome. Maybe we're an experiment. Maybe we're a zoo. Maybe they're just curious about how a species manages to survive its own stupidity long enough to discover atomic weapons. He paused, then added, or maybe they're waiting for us to grow up enough to handle the truth. And if we're not, if we never grow up, then the cover-up becomes permanent. Then the lie becomes the only reality we're allowed to have. As Jameson stood to leave, Patterson felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was about to publish a story that would shatter the comfortable illusions that had sustained human civilization for over 70 years. The reaction would be swift and merciless. Debunkers, government denials, character assassination, perhaps worse. But the truth, once released, would be impossible to contain. Like water finding its way through cracks in a dam, it would seep into every corner of human consciousness, forcing a reckoning that had been delayed for 7 decades. One more thing, Jameson said, turning back. When this story breaks, when the denials start, and the cover-up artists come out of the woodwork, remember this. Clarence, Chiles, and John Whitted were telling the truth. They saw what they said they saw, and they died knowing that their government had called them liars for the crime of being honest. Patterson watched the old archivist disappear into the morning crowd, becoming just another gray figure in a city full of secrets. Then he looked down at the envelope in his hands, at the documents that would change everything, and realized that the real story wasn't about alien spacecraft or government cover-ups. It was about what happens to a species when it becomes so afraid of the truth that it chooses comfortable lies instead. About how the greatest discovery in human history could be transformed into humanity's greatest shame. The sky over Alabama had held its secrets for 70 years, but secrets, like truth, had a way of demanding recognition. The thing that Chiles and Whitted had seen that night was still out there, still waiting, still watching. And perhaps, Patterson thought as he made his way back to his hotel, perhaps it was time for the watching to end. Time for humanity to look up at the stars and acknowledge that the eyes looking back weren't human. Time, at last, for the truth. The reckoning had been a long time coming, but like everything else in this story, the encounter, the cover-up, the slow revelation of what had been hidden, it was inevitable. Some truths are too big to stay buried forever, even the ones that change everything.